Hello and welcome to the latest Urban Manifesto webinar. It's Tuesday, so that must mean that it's Urban Manifesto again, the very last Urban Manifesto webinar episode of this very, very, very extraordinary, incredible, unbelievable year. I'm Lucy Bullivant. I'm a place strategist and I'm the founder of the urbanista.org webzine for livable urbanism. And together with my colleague Prathima Manohar, founder of the Urban Vision Think Do Tank, back in May of this year, we created Urban Manifesto, which is an exciting series of weekly webinars. And in each episode, we present the personal manifestos of all our expert guests from across very many different disciplines, backgrounds, and cultures globally. Manifestos for happier, healthier, more livable, and that means more equitable and resilient urban futures. Now, the pandemic and the massive, massive demands it brings of transitioning into a new era has provoked profound questions concerning the identities, the policies and processes of architecture, urban design and planning. And it's accelerated what was already a huge need to change course on every front imaginable. So in helping to meet the challenges brought about by COVID and at the same time climate emergency and to nurture a genuinely livable future, Urban Manifesto offers opportunities to learn, but also to unlearn old ways that have lost their relevance or which are downright unhelpful at this point in the 21st century. We are tackling a myriad of themes, ranging from co-housing to healthy buildings. Is density a boon or a bane? Making cities more mobile, sustainable finance, 24-hour economies. And we've added an exciting focus on plans for specific neighborhoods and cities globally, starting with Copenhagen and London. We would love you to keep watching our Urban Reset Roadmap for progressive, resilient and responsible urban change as the series advances into 2021. You can watch all the episodes that we've made to date on YouTube and Facebook if you look under the Urban Vision. How it works is very simple. Each week, our guest or our guests present their short manifesto priorities. We explore the themes in a Q&A, and then we invite you, our audience, to ask them whichever question you would like. So I'm really looking forward to today's episode. Over to you, Prathima, to introduce today's speaker and our theme. Thanks. Oh. Oh, she's on mute.
Sorry, I'm on mute.
Oh, that's the classic. Let's do that again.
Thanks, Lucy, and welcome again to a new episode of Urban Manifesto. Today we are discussing civic innovation for better cities, and we are so thrilled to have Nigel Jacob with us. He's joining us from the United States. He's the co-founder of Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, which is a civic innovation incubator and a R&D lab which set in Boston's City Hall. And I had the great pleasure of visiting them years ago when I was based in Boston. And Nigel's work is about making urban living better by using innovative, people-centered technological applications and design. And prior to joining the city of Boston in 2006, Nigel worked on a series of technological startups in the Boston area. He was a technologist in residence at Living Cities, which many of you would know as the philanthropic kind of collaborative of 22 of the world's largest foundations and financial institutions. He was also the board member at Code for America and Co-Urbanize. He's also now teaching at multiple universities. So Nigel, it's so lovely to see you again. How have you been this year, which has been, I think the only way to describe it is topsy-turvy, and it's not yet ended. I think we're still kind of battling this crazy pandemic. How have you uh, been this year?
Thanks for having me, Pratima and Lucy. It's been a difficult year. There's never been, this year there hasn't been a chance for us to kind of catch our breath, and so, there's in a lot of ways we've just been trying to position ourselves to respond in the best way possible and to make life in Boston as capable as possible, but it's been a chaotic year.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's a moment to reflect, and I think it's a moment to rethink how we want our future to be. And I think with Urban Manifesto, we are chatting with thought leaders and experts from around the world to, in a way, set an agenda for a fairer, happier, healthier urban future. So I'm so thrilled to have you here today because we're discussing a very, very important topic of civic innovation and how citizens can contribute to better urban life and how we can partner with government to, ensure that agenda. And I know, Nigel, you've prepared some initial remarks and outlined your urban manifesto for that vision. So I'm going to quickly dig up slides. And yeah, please tell us what your vision is for civic innovation for better cities.
Sounds good. I'll go through these pretty quickly, but just to give folks some grounding in who I am and what we do. So I run this organization in Boston City Hall called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. And the idea originally was to create the capacity for local government to respond to a changing world in creative ways, right? So that might mean working with local artists or local entrepreneurs or social entrepreneurs to make the city better in some way. And we were started in 2010 by our previous mayor, and the idea, our mission has more or less remained the same, to kind of create this capacity for creativity and innovation in local government. And over those 10 years, we've done lots of different kinds of things, working across the enterprise of government broadly, everything from public safety, public health, to roads and parks and all those sorts of things, but always with a very collaborative spirit and way of working. So these principles, I think capture a lot. It was usually I have described them. There's a lot more of these principles. So coming down with just three was a little painful, but happy to do it. So these are three principles that we've sort of picked as we look back on 10 years of work. These are sort of some of the key lessons that we've learned by doing this work and by working with the civic innovation ecosystem in Boston. So I'll go through these really quickly. So the first one, how you build is just as important as what you build. And I think maybe for the design community, this might be obvious or not, but certainly in local government and for people, because one of the trends of the last several years has been to try to introduce technology into the built environment. And I think that technologists, as a technologist, I can say this, I'm a computer scientist by background, there's engineers tend to boil things down into problems and solutions, right? You see a problem, you develop a solution, and then you roll it out. But when you're doing these things in a community where humans live, the way in which you do that and the way that you engage the community is vital. Number two, can we just go through this? Right. So, designing for the margins. This is the idea that, especially here in America, and just to kind of contextualize things, I am talking out of my experience of doing this work in Boston. And so I'm always careful not to overgeneralize, but so your mileage may vary, but I'm talking about my particular experience. I'm not assuming that this works everywhere or presuming, but designing for the margins, this was a key learning of ours, that if we're oftentimes in cities, especially American cities, certain populations and groups of folk are designed out of cities in a sense, or pushed to the edges, to the margins of society. And what we're finding is that the problems that are generated as a result of pushing people out, they create these long-standing issues that we struggle to deal with now. Everything from racism in all its forms, to oppression, to climate change. And so that we've found that focusing on those, centering on these marginal, what are, in air quotes, marginal issues, is a vital way to invigorate our practice. And then lastly, to be delightful. I think that this is something that we learned, that building cities is difficult, right? And designing communities is difficult, and doing that in a collaborative way. And so finding moments of delight where you can surprise people or create wonderful experience for our public to go through, and for these collaborations to happen, is a vital way to think about how to make these things more long-lived and more effective. So next slide, please. So this double-edged funnel, folks, especially with this population, you'll have seen versions of these from IDEO, unless these sort of global design firms. But this is intended to kind of highlight the experimental nature of what we do, right? So in urban mechanics, our sweet spot, I would say, is engaging in active exploration in terms of the changes that we want to see in community. So in the, there's kind of a 3-step framework for the way that we do the work: explore, experiment, and evaluate. So as we explore, we're talking to all the potential collaborators in the world, in the community, looking for ideas that we think will make life better in our city. And then once we can find those things and those partners, willing partners, we engage in experimentation, right? So, we try to make them literal experiments as much as we can. We're trying out an idea in a particular community with a particular group of people to see whether or not they will respond to this. Is this a good idea? Does it actually make life better? And then the final stage is really evaluating what we just did. Does this work? Does it not? And in this way, sort of, we found that this sort of disciplined approach to thinking about experimentation and creativity, it gives us the ability to handle risk and failure in government, which is sort of a new faculty, but one that we need if we're, the ability to experiment in collaboration with communities. We need to develop this capacity if we're going to take on the big issues that we need to in the modern world. Next. So designing for the margins, this is what Boston looked like, in the 60s. Not only this, certainly, but this was a major feature of Boston, of life in Boston. That, Boston has often been called one of the most racist cities in America. And there's lots of contenders historically, but the history of racial struggle and oppression in our city is one of those key underlying features that has set the context, the modern context. It's determined how the public transit system is set up, and the way where housing is available for different groups of people, and so on. And so unless we center on issues like racism and oppression and drag them out of the margins into the light, we will not be delivering on the potential value that people are demanding of us in this moment. Next. So lastly, this idea of delight, and I think in its own way, this is, I've always seen, like maybe in other fields, this is less surprising, but in government, the idea, especially in the US, the idea of local government being delightful is a foreign concept. And what we've discovered is whenever we can find those moments, like we try to make the experience of interacting with government and with big institutions as fun as possible, right? So it means that when we've been developing this idea that if you're going to be interacting with government, especially if you're around, rethinking the community life and so on, that should be a good experience, right? If you want people to come back again, we should do our best to make these fun and delightful experiences as much as we can. In this particular example, I think that device there, it's called the red contraption there. It's about the size and height of a parking meter, of an old school parking meter. And the idea that was that we were trying to engage people in a discussion of infrastructure. So we thought, what if we tried to challenge people's assumptions about infrastructure, especially technical infrastructure in cities. And so what happens is when you walk up to this device, and it was deployed in the public right of way, and you hold on to the ears, which you can barely make out there, it plays music back. It samples your heart rate and it plays music back to you in sync with your heart rate. And we didn't really announce it. We just put it out there, and we made it sort of like this findable, hopefully delightful experience that people would have. And so, as you can see, this person is, she's held on to it, and it started playing music, and she had no notion that would necessarily happen. But that then gave us the ability, essentially, in a non-creepy way, we'd sort of jump out of the bushes and we'd say, we would love to talk to you about infrastructure, having just challenged, I hope, her assumptions about what infrastructure was by creating this playful way of thinking about infrastructure, that it sort of created this different context for talking about infrastructure and so on. So I think that's about all I had. Those three key lessons: how you build is just as important as what you build, that the process is vital. Secondly, centering on designing for the margins, especially in an era where trying to figure out how technology can fit into the built environment. And then lastly, trying to be delightful in how we construct experiences for people and for collaborations with people is a vital way for structuring the way that we approach community groups.
Thank you, Nigel. I think that was great. And I think the work that you have started is, in a way, reimagining citizen engagement with government, reimagining community life, and our equations with how we engage with our local governments. And I think it's a great philosophical idea, in a way, to reimagine government and redistributing governance in the hands of the people. So I think that's a really cool, disruptive idea. And my first question to you is that we've already seen in many places that civic tech has shown us the true value of creating that engagement and feedback loop with the citizens. Could you talk to us a little bit about this? How do you define civic tech? How can you give us tangible examples of how we can use this to deliver better services to our citizens?
Yeah.
And I know Houston has done a ton in that area, and I lived there for a few years and was fascinated by that kind of exchange and interaction between government and citizens.
So civic tech is a broad area. It's been around for at least a decade, and it means different things to people. And I think it's mostly driven by who we're talking about, who's doing the doing. If it's government thinking about this, or if it's a private citizen thinking about civic tech, I think it takes different forms. But I think the idea is to use different ways to facilitate collaborations between the public and the public sector. But I mean, it doesn't only have to be those two parties. I mean, you can split up, the different institutions. So if a community development corporation is thinking about civic tech, it looks different versus the way that local government does it versus community groups. And so oftentimes these civic, I tend to use the phrase civic innovation to kind of bring it up one level. So it doesn't have to be technology. It can be about design. It can be about sort of creating experiences or public parks or something. But I think it's really any way to create these creative moments at the intersection of multiple institutions.
Yeah, and I think, can you give us a little more kind of tangible examples of how that improves
Sure.
our uh, daily life?
Sure. Sure. So one of the early waves of this work in this country was 311 systems, right? So 311 systems in the U.S. are uh, they're sort of based on like hotlines, right? So you have a phone number that the public can use to get service, right? So if you see something broken or damaged, something that needs to be changed in the public right of way, in the built environment, and if government presumably has a part to play in the fixing, as it often does here, you can call that number 311. And they'll come and do it. And so it was around 2010 or slightly before that, we began to see apps and different kinds of technologies showing up that could actually make that experience better or quicker or more effective than just the phone line. Because sometimes when people see something that's broken, they're too angry to call someone to speak to somebody about what the issue is. It's often more effective to use an app to grab a photo, and it will automatically grab your location, and then you hit send. So like the experience is much more it's shorter and hopefully more gratifying than just sort of writing an email and sending it off into the ether, in which case it's not clear what will happen. With these 311 systems, you're given a traffic number and you get a photo of the item once it's been fixed. So these kinds of technologies that are used in the case of government, to enable people to work with government more effectively, in a lot of ways was like the vanguard of civic tech or civic innovation. But not only, I mean, certainly there was lots of like civic art, that was tried around the country, that often they encourage people to take over public spaces and to use them in different ways. So there's, in a lot of ways, it's about getting services done more effectively, but not only.
Yeah. No, I think it's a fascinating way to kind of tackle community issues.
One of the things that is interesting about this, that even in this country, the way that it's when I say that how you build this stuff is just as important as what you build. In America, different parts of the country have different expectations over what government does. So
Right.
on the East Coast and the West Coast, there's often a higher bar, right? There's more expectations of local government, but in the not exclusively, but towards the middle of the country, the Midwest, oftentimes people want to see government less. They want to see less of government intervention or government creativity. So it's interesting. You have to listen to what the public is telling you and respond in kind. It's not as though it's not as though you can just borrow solutions from other places and just deployment and expect good things to happen. You really have to consider what the expectations are of your population.
Yeah, I'm totally sold on tech for good. I've written books on the relationship between design and technology, and I also have followed your work and watched your videos. I love what you do. It seems to me, there are various iterations or various incarnations of tech for good, whether it's you can chart the trajectory, whether it's Pokemon, which hyperlocal, geolocal kinds of projects, through to say a group like Neighborland, where they mounted a civic campaign to promote and support food trucks. That all goes into that kind of really fascinating ecosystem, along with the very, very necessary job of smoothing the roads and so on. I mean, for me, one of the key things is two things that you said, under the heading of how you build, is that you're actually really focusing on what people really need, what they really want, and you're challenging their instincts and coming to them from a position of emotional intelligence. So I'm thinking very much, point 2, where you refer to marginalized, disenfranchised communities. Tell us about the specific examples of social innovation, whether it includes high or low tech or not. Have you has the office been responsible for that really directly address the issues faced by marginalized communities?
Well,
what are you most proud of in that respect, would you say?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways of thinking about that. In some cases, a social entrepreneur will come to us with an idea or a thought about how to change what government is doing and how to make it more impactful, or it's really about collaboration. And so in those cases, it's about us trying to find the right partner in local government to be able to align with that community group. But one of the projects in the space that is one of the first projects, or one of the projects in the space that sticks out most in my mind, is one of the earliest projects that we undertook, which was thinking about the master planning in our Chinatown. So Boston has a small but mighty, compared to New York, Chinatown, and it's very different now than it once was. It's really more Asia town. There's a lot of different people from different backgrounds, different parts of the world living there, and the question was, what does the future of Boston Chinatown look like? And it was a very contentious project, or contentious planning experience, where again, like, people were talking about, is it about retail, or is it about hotels and supporting conferences and that sort of thing. And so thinking about how do we plan for the future of this rather small, geographically small part of the city. And so we realized that was an opportunity there. So we worked with an organization called the Asian Community Development Corporation, ACDC, and because they were actively involved in this planning exercise, and we came up with this idea. It was a line of work that we had been pursuing for a few years, in which we were trying to use games to facilitate civic dialogue, especially contentious dialogue, as this certainly was. And so we created a platform called Participatory Chinatown that could be used by the Asian Community Development Corporation to facilitate, in support, with us supporting, to have this conversation with their community about the different kinds of possible futures of the city, so that people could be heard and community and conversations could be had across generations and across ethnic groups about what the future of their neighborhood was, a conversation that was really difficult to have otherwise. And so that was a good first step, I think, of our team in thinking about how can government creativity play to support the needs in a particular community, that traditionally has been sidelined. And so that was a lot of fun. And we were able to get young people working with older people, and very different kinds of demographics of people that typically take part in planning processes to take part.
Wow, that's a beautiful example, really beautiful example of shared knowledge, the sharing of knowledge across generations, and something that, taking information out of the silos, which is, obviously at the heart of what you're doing. Yeah, fantastic. Prathima?
And Nigel, my next question to you is about, the fact that, I just want to kind of set the context for this. A lot of people spoke about how this pandemic almost feels like a preview to the other big challenge that we are going to face, which is climate change. And this year, you've seen pretty radical responses from government to, handle this kind of unexpected health crisis. We've not seen a similar response to climate change across the world, and it is really the biggest emergency that we are facing. And one of the things that we all recognize is that tackling climate change is, it's heavily dependent on citizen behavior, and behavior change is potentially one of the crucial elements to tackle climate change and move towards, a more kind of zero carbon world. So I'd love to kind of hear from you. Is there ways that civic tech can drive better and more responsible citizen behavior? Are there examples where technology has gamified us to do better?
Mhm. I think there are lots of examples of where technology has encouraged behavior change. Uh, I mean, there is a difference between games and gamifying things, but in general, I think that one of the things that a lot of these platforms, like technological platforms, allow us to do is to facilitate collaboration. Because I think at the heart of the behavior change we're trying to see is aligning perspectives, getting people to work together, right? Getting community groups to work with government, to work with the social sector. And I think that in our country right now, trust is a vital resource, right? People don't trust each other, across large segments of our society. And so the more, I think there's a lot of opportunity to build trustful relationships across different segments of society and across different sectors to take on those big issues, because, one or two community groups working towards, some big climate change goals is good, but we need all of them working towards this direction. Right. And I think one way to do that is to use technology to facilitate collaborations and to have difficult conversations, right? Because one of the things that we're beginning to see is, different parts of the city think differently about the changes that are needed. So for example, supposing if we decide to shut down all vehicular traffic in the city, there are a lot of parts of our city that, especially immigrant, struggling socioeconomically parts of our city, that if we were to do that, it cuts off their livelihoods. And so that's a difficult conversation to have. Like, I mean, at the same time, these vehicles are polluting and causing climate change, but without, transportation, people can't get to work, right? People are cut off from their livelihoods. And so I think that it's not as simple, I think, as cutting something off, but I think that there is a way for us to find sort of hybrid solutions by having genuine dialogue across all of these different barriers, so that there's empathy built between the folks downtown, say, versus the people that are sort of further removed from the city core, where the transportation networks are not as good. And so I think that the situation is actually quite good for technology to be used in that way. But I will say that it's very difficult to do, right? Having conversations facilitated by the platforms is, in some ways, there's no magic to it. It creates new opportunities using the technological platforms, but we still have to be very thoughtful about how the conversations are facilitated and who's present. And so it does require a lot of thought and planning. But I do think there is a huge opportunity to engage in that sort of work and to build trustful relationships.
And I think the world needs to see more such examples.
Yeah. And I think that we're in a place now where I think, tech-based platforms are often used to separate people. I think our recent election was, the last two elections were good examples of that, where people increasingly are less trustful of each other, right? There's, you choose your own facts, apparently. But I think that it doesn't have to be designed that way. Like, I think this is the opportunity for design, right? So it is really about, the sort of design characteristics and the design values and goals that we build into the experiences. And as long as if we're taking a thoughtful approach, and it requires different models, I think. When somebody always has to make money at the end of one of these things, it's a very difficult situation, right? Because that means they're going to monetize everything they can, and right, everyone's data is lost. But if that is not the primary motivating factor, and if it's about trust and empathy, that I think that we can have different kinds of conversations. I think that, but so there is, I think, a piece of this ecosystem that is just not all that well developed. Namely, how do you build technological platforms where someone doesn't always have to get rich off of the interaction? Maybe what if the main benefit is trust within the community, or trust across community? So I think that, there are opportunities to build there.
Yeah, I think it'd be nice to see this kind of movement around, pushing the communities to do better across the world. And we'll be looking to some of the pilots and programs that you were doing at New Urban Mechanics in Boston. Lucy?
So, Nigel, I've got a question which picks up on the issue, the central heart of the issue of trust. But let me say, so absolutely countless examples that we can all think of historically where social innovation has really benefited civic conditions. You know, all the huge leaps that mankind has made to go forward. And so many of them in the past have, in the more recent past, maybe if we think of examples about faster, better, cheaper. But at the same time, this fundamental need to build and not only build trust in the short term, but do that very difficult thing of sustaining it. Mm-hmm. Also, I think something that's coming out right now with our very strong need to adapt is the need to use capacities to deploy all the resources that we have in cities in new, more sustainable and very holistic ways. So tell us, why does social innovation matter more now than ever today, both in your city of Boston, across the US and in the wider world, if you can touch on that too. Thanks.
Sure. So, I think social innovation has always played a huge part in American society, right? If we were to think about, right from the civil rights struggle, that which is certainly a kind of social innovation. It's what drives change. I think government is a big and slow institution that takes some time to pivot and to make the changes needed to respond to a changing world. And so I think that social innovation has always created the capacity when there's good collaboration between social innovation and big institutions to change in those directions, to try out new ideas. And I would say that it's more than just local government. I think universities also are other big institutions at play in cities that need to find ways to be more creative. And so I think social innovators, they bring a different kind of spirit to the work, a different kind of thought process as far as resources and different ways of thinking about the community, right? So whenever one of my pet peeves is when government folk call our residents customers. Right? They're not our customers. They are our residents. And if it is like I think we borrow these metaphors that I think that break down from the public sector or from the private sector. And I think that we can often it would be better for us to borrow from the social sector to say when they're supporting, impacting people's lives, and they're measuring that impact. I think it gives us a different way of thinking about the role of government as in terms of its working within the community. And I think that the social sector, by their very nature, right, they're trying to find resources, trying to find partners in the community, and most good social entrepreneurs think very carefully and deeply about trust, and are they building sort of rich relationships within the community that can be leveraged and built upon over time. I think government often doesn't do that work or doesn't do it well, doesn't think about the relationships they have in the community and how that changes over time, and how do we change the way that we behave in communities. I think government often goes into a community discussion with a presumption that they have the right answer or they know the right answer, and I think that there has to be a way to approach those community conversations with a sense of vulnerability, so that we're genuinely collaborating with the group. And that's something that the social innovation, social creativity world, social justice community has been doing for a long time. So I think it's about learning about how to take some of the lessons of that world, adapt them for government, and to change the way we think about what government does and community governance and all these different issues.
Oh, boy, do I totally agree with you. I mean, I think, given my thinking about my own city of London, there's massive potential at this point for new alliances between local governments, whether they're in the different boroughs or whether it's the actual central local government of a city. The third sector, all the charities, non-profits, the different types of non-profits, the social entrepreneurs. We can, because we need systemic change to happen so radically now. The things can be transcended. Well, I mean, we have already transcended many things this year, but we've got a long way to go still. So your work is never over. I would say that, as you probably are completely aware yourself.
Yeah.
But thanks very much for your answer, Prathima.
Nigel, in your urban mechanics, you use civic, citizen, and private sector innovation to, in a way, disrupt government and make it more effective. Could you talk to us a little bit about that? How has civic innovation enabled better, more effective governance? Could you also give us a few tangible examples so we can get to understand it a little bit better?
So the way that we've conceived of it over the years, in order to be able to do new things or creative things, innovation, however you want to frame it, because different people like to use different language, equivalent language to capture that. But I think the question of how does an institution think about risk and failure is a good way to get into the conversation, right? So in order to do anything innovative, the potential for risk and for failure has to exist, right? Because if you're not facing any potential risk, you probably aren't trying hard enough, right? If anything worth trying presents some kind of risk. And so, the way that we started some of this work was to realize that the way that we handle risk and failure right now is bureaucracy, right? In government, right? Government bureaucracy is the risk management strategy. It's just not a great one, right? So what generally happens is that the bureaucracy slows things down to a snail's pace and often pulls out the best parts of the solution in order to make them more palatable to the government as an institution. But I think that the way that we've thought about it instead, rather than approaching it that way, let's create a unit within government, which is our team, the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, that is allowed to take risks and is allowed to fail, right? Because that is the only way that I know of that you can think, that you can imagine how a potential new idea, how it will or won't work. You have to be able to try it and see if people like it, because it's not a foregone conclusion just because it's a new idea that people will respond to it or that people will like it or want to use it. And so that's something that we borrowed not only from the private sector, but from the social sector. I will say that my thinking on this has changed a little, especially when we think about some of the newer concepts in the private sector. I think that oftentimes not all of those concepts, I think, map cleanly into the public sector. I think that we're here to stay, and one of the advantages, or one of the operating modes of the private sector, is that they can try something, they can push out a product, and then they can look to see if people use it or don't use it. And if they don't use it, they can just pull it out, yank it from the market. I don't know that we have exactly that freedom in the public sector. I think we need to be a little bit more thoughtful, right? Because as soon as people will get used to, somebody is probably using even a poorly developed service that the government is running. Someone somewhere is using it. And so to yank it back without any notice, I think is a mistake, because people, again, because we're trying to build relationships. So some care needs to be given into how do you frame the issue for the community to say that we're going to try this new idea for some fixed amount of time, and then after that it's going to be rolled back, but what the intent is to see if it will actually work at all, and then we'll either scale it or shut it down or something. And so I think that I think some thought needs to be given to the sort of the conceptual models that we borrow from the private sector. But I do think there's a lot that we can learn, in terms of how to be flexible. But, like even the word innovation, again, here in the US, often has a connotation of breaking things, right? Move fast and break things. That's Facebook's motto. Like, what what does that mean in the community? Do we want to break things in a community? Probably not. And so we need to think carefully about the model of innovation that we're using. And I think it's probably based on collaboration, right? By working with community groups to think, and to think about like the value, what is if we're going to roll something out, how do we ensure that some experiment or some prototype, it benefits the community in some way, right? So for example, I was talking about that example with participatory Chinatown, and there the idea was, even if people don't like the result of that process, at the very least, what we've done through that process, we knew that it was basically a virtual game. It was a digital game.
Right.
And that we would build a bunch of different scenarios of the future of Chinatown. And people would have these avatars, and they would go through these different scenarios and then leave comments about what they liked or didn't like about the different possible futures for their neighborhood. And we knew that a lot of older people probably would not respond well to the digital platform, or necessarily would even feel comfortable using computers. And we saw that as an opportunity. And so we were able to train up some young people to be, we called them digital Sherpas. And so they would be trained up in how to use the platform, and then would be paired with people that were reluctant to use the computer. And so in that way, for people that wanted the support of a digital Sherpa, that you would also be facilitating this dialogue between typically older adults and these young people about communities, about their community, something that often does not happen at all. And so I think that there are ways of working through these opportunities that actually, so in that way, the community, even for having just taken part in a short amount of time, even if it didn't work in the end, in terms of people were happy with the final master plan, they did have the experience of collaborating with an older person, something they wouldn't have done otherwise, or with a younger person, which they wouldn't have done otherwise. So sorry that was such a long-winded answer, but I think there are ways of doing this. They just require some design.
Also, they take so much more ownership, and they were kind of participating in making the plans with their community.
Exactly, and it's a skill, right? So I think that oftentimes when we engage with a community, skills and experiences are things that we can leave behind that don't leave, right? So if the particular idea doesn't work out, at the very least, you've introduced somebody to a different way of thinking about an issue, or a different way of engaging in an issue, which I think is a net improvement over the situation.
Yeah. Thanks, Nigel. And before I go to Lucy, I want to say hello to the amazing community that joins us as we talk about the Urban Manifesto for our future. Ashok Goel says, Namaskar. Ella says hello. So welcome everybody. And if you have any questions or comments, you could leave it in the video box below, and we'll try to take a few if we can. Lucy, go ahead.
Okay, so Nigel, got a bit of echo. One of the government's biggest responsibilities is obviously accommodation of all its citizens and people within a city. And I remember you in one of your earlier talks online talking about Boston, and I think you said density is a bad word. So Boston being relatively small city, growing, can't grow outwards, and there are restrictions on how high you can build housing. So I remember you also showed a great slide of a smaller housing unit. So I don't know if they were technically pod housing units, but as we've seen in other contexts. But tell us about the process of evaluating the social innovations within the housing sector in Boston.
So the starting point for my team, for New Urban Mechanics, was the housing department had been having a series of conversations with communities about the physical future of the city as it relates to housing, and the issue of density was a hot topic. The Boston is 49 square miles. I'm not sure what that is in kilometers. I should know as a Canadian, but Boston is only going to get denser, right? Infill. And so people weren't happy about that. Americans traditionally have like their big houses as symbols of prosperity and, the American dream and so on. And so they were having a lot of problems just like talking about, and again, like it wasn't about any particular design. It was more about introducing the idea that the future of Boston is going to be smaller footprint houses, probably. And so the way that the housing department was going about that issue was to, again, show trend lines and showing numbers about number of people per unit, sort of unit distance area within the city, and people were very unhappy about the situation. Why can't we? It came up like people were proposing all sorts of things. Why can't we build in the harbor? What we can't, and which isn't to say that we shouldn't, but the question of how comfortable people were thinking about density was a big issue. And so we began to realize that one of the problems is that the housing department was appealing to people's reason, just be reasonable. This is the trend. And so we're going to be up here. And so we have to plan for that, and oftentimes when you're talking about people's homes and housing, and their families and their communities, it's not only about reason, right? It's also about emotion, right? A lot of our great moments of our lives happen in our communities, in our houses. And so imagining those getting smaller is not palatable to a lot of people. And so we saw that as an opportunity. And the opportunity, as we saw it, was to change the nature of the conversation, right? So to move away from primarily focusing on reason, which is, we need reason, but to use that as the primary motivating factor or the primary way into the conversation didn't seem to be working. So instead, we had this thought: let's actually, instead of talking about a tiny house or a small house in Boston, let's actually build one so that people have something to react to, so that they're not talking in the abstract; they're talking about something physical. And again, we had to, there's some subtlety here, because we were saying that we're not going to build this specific tiny house, but what we're trying to do is to inform the conversation from people's intuition, to have to grow your intuition about the livability of a small house. And so we built one. It was a little more than 800 square feet, and so minimum square footage in Boston housing is more than 1,000. So it was a significant change to propose, to the zoning code, but more than that, it was really about building up people's intuition about the livability of these small houses. And so we built it and we drove it, and we called it the Urban Housing Unit, and we drove it around the city. It was small enough that we could put it on the flatbed truck and drive it around to many different neighborhoods, and then use it as a spur to a conversation, or to spur a conversation about the livability of these spaces. And so we would invite people into the house, and we had it furnished, and so it looked like a real house. And so then we could use it as an opportunity to start a conversation. Could you imagine your older parents living here? Because a lot of our older residents want to age in place. They don't want to go and live in an old age home necessarily. So then we were able to talk through that, and people, rather than sort of pointing at a chart and saying, no, I don't like this, but instead they were looking around at the physical space of this house and saying, this is actually pretty livable. And so it changed the nature of the conversation. And so that people were starting from a different place, right? They had an intuitive sense about how these spaces could be built and how livable they could be. And so in that way, we were able to inform the discussion in a new way, rather than just showing numbers and charts.
Yeah, that's really, really intriguing. That's great that you did that, particularly to drive it around. I think we call it demonstration housing, and it's completely different, a world away from, going to a marketing suite. Right. They did it very effectively at the Glasgow Architecture and Design Festival a few years ago. And it has been done in London. In fact, it was done after the Second World War, when we were building the welfare state. In East London, in Poplar, there was demonstration prototype housing. It's done in Scandinavia quite a bit too. But I think you're completely right. We really need to do more of it, because it builds cultural conversations and breaks down, sort of more, breaks down a kind of mindset of, people are resistant to changing their approaches.
And so we've sort of, there's been a takeoff on this line of inquiry, so one of the, in Boston, one of the responses to a growing public that we took back in the early 1900s were housing called, they're generally colloquially called triple deckers. They're these sort of 3-level kind of apartment-like buildings, but they're the kind of freestanding houses. And it's like a very traditional, if you drive around Boston, around a residential part of our city, you'll see them everywhere. They're in movies often. And so people, they adapted the triple decker to their needs, right? Because part of it was about being close to family. So, the 3 levels, what eventually happened was that there was this vision that you could live in one of the units, you have your, extended family living in another unit, and then you rent out the other one, right? So in this way, it's both a way to build and maintain community as well as to grow financial wealth. And so, that way of thinking, I think is kind of, it comes directly out of the urban housing unit. How do we tap people's, how do we marry like the future of housing with social change, with the narrative of social change? And so some colleagues of ours created a visioning process around the future of the triple decker. What is the future of the triple decker, right? So, and a lot of it was about the social innovation that happened in the triple decker community 50 years ago. Right, when the GIs were coming back from the World Wars, they were then able to buy these, and then they adapted them to their different uses, and so on. So, I think so in the line of inquiry about how do we encourage social innovation happening in the housing is something that we're still pursuing.
Yeah, brilliant. So we have a few minutes left, Nigel, and I think we both, Prathama and I, have got 2 very quick questions for you. So we'll move on quickly to Prathama's.
Now, Nigel, my question to you, and I'm going to tweak it a little bit, Lucy, is, understand a little bit about what are the, what's the mix needed by a city to enable civic innovation? Like, what are the, what you've done in Boston, and you were kind of in the vanguard of that. So if you're going to say advise cities around the world, especially the emerging world, tell us what are the kind of key components that have to be there within the political leadership and governments to enable this engine of civic innovation. What attitude should they have? Should they civic innovation office? What are the things we should do to enable this kind of
So
innovation?
So it's a very good question. So I think like one of the places to start is to realize, I mean, this may be an obvious thing, but a lot of cities don't often start here, is to realize that civic innovation is about an ecosystem, right? You have different sectors playing different roles. And my experience in this city, I'm not actually in Boston, but in Boston, is that oftentimes the players in these different institutions and different sectors want to collaborate, right? And so the challenge is, who is the facilitator, right? And oftentimes, in American cities, government sits at the center of that ecosystem, right? Oftentimes, they send out the grant dollars that come down from the government or from the philanthropies. They often have, they can understand the development patterns that are happening in the city and so on. So I think that not only, but in cities like East Coast American cities, government can be a facilitator for supporting and encouraging that network. The way when we started doing this work, we were often surprised, not shocked, but we were surprised that there's such little interaction between the universities, certainly within each other, but also with the social innovation world, right? And also with government. And so we saw that as a problem and an opportunity, and so part of our work was to facilitate those interactions and to understand the needs and the challenges of these different sectors, and to introduce people to each other. And so some of those relationships that we engaged in years ago are still ongoing. They've been institutionalized into these ongoing relationships. And so I think that is a role that government can play, kind of to support the ecosystem, the network, and to see yourself as like a key enabler of that. Because oftentimes we have the resources to support that. We have the money, and we have the longer term vision and those kinds of things, but not always.
Right.
And so I think if you're going to create an operation in local government to allow for that, I mean, you have to give them some freedom, right? So innovation requires exploration, right? And so you have to give people some space to innovate. You can't, I think oftentimes the way government wants to proceed from this is that you have to clearly define innovation. And I think that's a mistake, right? Because you can't, before you've done the work, you can't know what this innovation team will be good at, right? And so I think you have to give them some time and some space, which isn't to say that you have to let them go, freewheeling, but you have to give them some space and some context, right? And you have to staff them, right? You don't get innovation for free. So it has to be, I do think it has to be somebody's job, which isn't to say that you have to create an office like ours, but there do have to be people. Like one of the biggest problems in government is the silos, right? The vertical silos that are created. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I was trying to figure out what a good European metaphor would be. But and the challenge is that there are often too few people in those silos who are empowered to be able to walk across those silos. Oftentimes, it might be a chief of staff or the department head who feels empowered to do that. But I think that it has to be a broader cultural thing. And so I think creating some flexibility to allow people to step outside of the everyday. I remember when we were first starting this work, and one of the first things, I first came to doing this work straight out of grad school. And so it was natural for me when I was first asked to do this job to then reach out to the universities, to MIT, and to Harvard. And I remember a lot of my colleagues at City Hall got really angry to say, why does Nigel and his little band of merry friends get to go and do these things? And so we discovered, and so we had to sort of talk through this narrative to say that, getting out of City Hall is a vital part of this job, that we have to be building relationships, with universities and startups and community groups, so if we're going to be able to facilitate this network. So I think whatever is creating flexibility and context within some kind of people within government, to allow them to do that and to encourage them, to really require them to do that, to say we have to get out of City Hall to understand what's happening in the city. And we also need to talk to these other institutions that have a part to play, and then try to figure out the intersections to figure out what kind of collaborative opportunities are there. And what we found was that these different institutions are rich with possibilities, right? We have, a huge number of universities and colleges and nonprofits and community groups in our city. And the opportunity is to sort of find ways to stitch them together into a network to do interesting things. And I think that's where you get civic innovation, that when you can have these kind of collaborative partnerships.
And it's such a nice way to describe that vision as government playing that enabling role to create that ecosystem, of disruptive innovation. And I remember, studying in Boston, and we had studios at school which were kind of engaging with the your office to figure out more participatory planning. I remember that. It benefits the city, it benefits the citizens, the students love it, because there were some real projects that came out of that as well.
And when you think about it, if you're a community group, and this doesn't always happen, but it often happens. If a professor approaches your community group, someone you've never heard of, or from an institution that you don't trust, why will you trust that professor, right? And oftentimes we see this, that where the community group won't trust the professors because they represent Harvard or MIT, a very rich institution full of people that don't look like you or don't speak your language, and they want to come and fix your problems. It's a non-starter. But if you can, there's a need for a trusted relationship. And so if that can be government, it creates this opportunity where if the community knows me and the team, then if we're partnering with that university professor, it becomes a very different kind of trustful relationship, right? So that they're able to work build on top of our, the university professor, are able to build our trustful relationship with the community. You see, and so in this way, that collaborations that can happen that wouldn't have otherwise. I think there's lots of potential.
Yeah, that's true.
It kind of depends on your situation, right? And so, but it does bear like scrutiny in terms of trying to figure out what are the barriers between collaboration and the different sectors.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great model. Lucy?
Right. Okay. So let's make this last one a quickie. I think it's actually quite complex, but let's give it a go. Obviously, experimentation is really comes with the territory of civic innovation. And one thing you've described, the way in which you've described you and the staff that you lead in your office, it's described yourselves as risk aggregators. Can you explain, Nigel, what this means and how your risk aggregation has changed during the pandemic, and how do you anticipate it evolving in the coming year?
It's a good question. So risk aggregation is this idea that expecting our colleagues who deliver, who like the frontline workers, expecting them to be creative. I mean, it's good to be able to hope for it, but they already have a job, right? And just putting an expectation that they'll be trying out new ideas, I think, is often a bridge too far. And so, because they're worried about risk oftentimes. And so the idea of risk aggregation is that they can offload the risk of a new idea, of exploring a new idea, onto us, that we can essentially aggregate the risk for them or from them. And so if the transportation department wants to understand, the role that autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, robot cars will have in the built environment, maybe they're worried about negative backlash in the press, they can then give that project to us, essentially. And I mean, they still stay involved, but it really becomes a new urban mechanics project, so that we take the risk for them to explore that idea. So we can aggregate it from them, or they can kind of deposit it with us. And so, but the work still gets done, but not in a way that these other, frontline departments have to worry about, being exposed to negative press or something. So that's the idea.
Okay, and has the way in which you do risk aggregation changed in the last 9 months during the pandemic?
Certainly, the topics that have come up have changed over the last 9 months. I would say the way we work really hasn't changed very much. I think the need is the same. In some cases, different departments need to change the way they think about a particular service, and they feel nervous about a particular kind of a solution, and so we'll say, "Hey, new urban mechanics, can you help us explore how we could use texting to allow people to make requests for food distribution or something?" And that's something that we know how to do, and so it becomes less risky overall because we've done projects like that in the past. But also then that department can't be accused of wasting their time when they should be of exploring this idea, when they should be doing other things, when they should be delivering their core service. And so I would say that in this moment, 2020, the need for risk aggregation has become greater. That there's a greater need for supporting risk takers, or finding ways to move risk off of the plate of frontline workers to a lab or a unit who is empowered to do that. In 2021, 2021 is a bit of a mystery. Like, there's so much that's changing, and there's so many moving bits. We, in addition to having a new president, and the vaccines are coming out en masse. We also have a mayoral election next year, so there's a lot of moving parts. So understanding where we should be spending our time is something that we're still trying to figure out, and we're sort of consulting with all of these different agencies to understand the way that they are thinking about the future and the way the mayor is thinking about the future, and so on. But I think 2021 will be a challenging year.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. 2021 is going to be the year we're all hoping we can have real agency to bring about change in a hugely positive way. And Nigel, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. You have one of the biggest, most fascinating jobs that I can really almost think of, and such a hugely important role that you play. It's great to know that you moved into this straight after grad school, so you have built up such a repertoire and a wealth of knowledge. I think, Prathama and I have really, really enjoyed hearing what you've had to say about civic innovation in its various forms, and starting from the why, starting from the absolute reality of people's lives and their emotions and what they need, and the way they look upon their fellow citizens, and ways of living together better in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nigel. This was a fascinating conversation, and I hope I can come back to Boston and meet you in person soon.
That would be awesome. Maybe wait till later in the year.
Yeah.
To make your visit. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun chatting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nigel. Happy holidays.
Same to you both.
Happy holidays to everybody.
Thank you.